My name is Amber, 34 years old, and I am a financial auditor. When I found my 82-year-old grandmother shivering in an abandoned park in the freezing rain, holding nothing but a plastic grocery bag, I thought it was a terrible accident. Then my mother answered her phone from a five-star restaurant and told me they left her there on purpose to teach her a lesson about her pension. I simply hung up, wrapped my coat around my grandmother, and prepared to dismantle their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought they could get away with anything. It was 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The Chicago suburbs were getting hammered by a brutal winter storm. Freezing rain lashed against my windshield as I took a detour past Centennial Park on my way home from a late shift at my accounting firm. The park was completely deserted, the streetlights flickering against the heavy sleet. That was when I saw a small, frail figure sitting on a rusted iron bench near the duck pond. I slammed on my brakes, my tires sliding slightly on the icy pavement. I did not even grab my umbrella before jumping out of the car. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted across the freezing wet grass. It was my grandmother Ruth. She was 82 years old, wearing only a thin autumn cardigan that was entirely soaked through. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered and her pale hands were tightly gripping a cheap plastic grocery bag. "Grandma," I screamed, falling to my knees in the mud beside her. "What are you doing out here? Where is your coat?" She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She could barely speak through her shivering. "Amber," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They took my purse. They said I had to sit here and think about my choices." I grabbed the plastic grocery bag from her freezing hands. Inside, there were no keys, no wallet, and no phone. There was only a change of clothes and a stack of her confidential medical documents, the ink already bleeding from the rain that had seeped into the bag. Pure, blinding panic washed over me quickly, followed by a rage so intense it made my hands shake. I pulled off my heavy winter coat and wrapped it tightly around her frail shoulders. I guided her to my car, blasted the heater to the maximum setting, and buckled her in. Once she was safely inside the warm vehicle, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother, Sharon. My parents were supposed to be taking Ruth out to dinner tonight to celebrate a family milestone. The phone rang 3 times before my mother answered. Through the receiver, I could hear the unmistakable sounds of an upscale restaurant. Crystal glasses clinking, soft jazz music playing in the background, and the low murmur of wealthy patrons enjoying their expensive meals. "Hello," my mother answered, her voice dripping with casual annoyance. "Amber, make it quick. Your father and I are celebrating." "Celebrating what?" I demanded, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Mom, I just found Grandma Ruth sitting alone in the freezing rain at Centennial Park. She does not have her phone or her purse. What is going on?" I expected my mother to gasp, to panic, to ask if Ruth was okay. Instead, she let out a long, dramatic sigh. "She is being stubborn, Amber. We just needed her to sign over the pension routing numbers for our new commercial development loan. The bank needs to see liquid capital by tomorrow morning, and she absolutely refused to cooperate." I stared at the windshield, watching the sleet bounce off the glass, entirely unable to process what I was hearing. "You left an 82-year-old woman in an abandoned park in the middle of a freezing storm because she would not give you her pension?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "She needs to understand that choices have consequences," my mother stated, taking a sip of what sounded like wine. "Since she wants to be so fiercely independent with her finances, we decided to let her be independent. She will call us from a payphone when she is ready to cooperate and sign the papers." "Mom, she could have frozen to death. She could have been attacked. She is your husband's mother." "She is fine," my mother snapped, dropping the pretense of politeness. "Do not try to play the hero, Amber. You always were overly dramatic just because we invested in your sister Brittany's lifestyle brand instead of your boring accounting degree. This is exactly why Brittany is going to be the face of this family development project, and you are just a glorified calculator. You do not understand how business works. We need that pension money to secure our legacy." The casual cruelty of her words was a familiar weapon. Growing up, my younger sister Brittany had always been the golden child. Whatever Brittany wanted, Brittany got. Designer clothes, luxury cars, a fully funded business venture that produced nothing but shallow social media posts. Meanwhile, I was the designated scapegoat, the boring daughter who had to pay her own way through college and was constantly belittled for choosing a stable, practical career in financial auditing. But this was a completely new level of depravity. They were willing to risk my grandmother's life to fund their commercial real estate dreams. "I am taking her to my apartment," I said coldly, "and you are never getting near her again." My mother laughed, a sharp grating sound that echoed through the phone. "Good luck with that, Amber. You cannot protect her from us. We are her family." She hung up, leaving me listening to the dead silence of the disconnected line. I threw the car into drive and sped toward my apartment complex. The entire drive, Ruth sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window with a look of profound heartbreak. She had always known her son Thomas and daughter-in-law Sharon were deeply greedy people, but being physically abandoned in the freezing rain had shattered whatever illusions she had left. When we arrived at my apartment, I immediately drew a hot bath for her and found my warmest pajamas. I made her a cup of hot tea and sat with her on my sofa, rubbing her hands until the color finally returned to her knuckles. "I am so sorry, Amber," she whispered, staring into her teacup. "I should have given them the routing numbers. I just did not want them to ruin the last of my security." "You have nothing to apologize for, Grandma," I told her firmly. "It is your money. They have no right to touch a single cent of it." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the warmth of the apartment finally chasing away the brutal chill of the park. I was already formulating a plan in my head. As a professional financial auditor, I knew exactly how to lock down bank accounts, freeze assets, and flag fraudulent activity. I was going to make sure my parents could not touch her pension, her home, or her life savings. I stood up to grab my laptop from the kitchen counter, ready to dive into her banking portals and secure her assets before my parents could try another tactic. Just as my fingers brushed the keyboard, a sudden aggressive pounding echoed through my apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of someone demanding immediate entry. I froze in my tracks. Ruth gasped, her teacup rattling loudly against the saucer. The pounding happened again, louder this time, rattling the doorframe of my small apartment. "Open up." "Police department." My heart dropped into my stomach. I walked slowly to the front door and pressed my eye against the peephole. Standing in the brightly lit hallway were two uniformed police officers, and standing right behind them, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a smug, victorious smile, was my father Thomas. The battle had just begun. I took a deep breath to force my racing heart to slow down. Panic was exactly what my father wanted. He had spent my entire childhood thriving on intimidation and control. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door just wide enough to address the officers, while firmly using my body to block my father from stepping inside. "Good evening, officers," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and professional. "How can I help you tonight?" The taller officer stepped forward, his expression stern and unyielding. "Mom, we received an urgent distress call from this gentleman. He states you have unlawfully taken his elderly mother from his care and that she suffers from severe late-stage dementia. We need to come inside and check on her well-being immediately." My father pushed his way closer to the door, thrusting a printed document toward the officers, with a look of manufactured grief. "My daughter has completely lost her mind," he said, using his practiced, authoritative business voice. "She is financially unstable and estranged from this family. She abducted my mother tonight to try and extort us. This is a medical emergency. My mother is highly confused, prone to wandering, and incapable of making her own decisions. I have the preliminary medical evaluations right here." I stared at my father, marveling at how easily the lies slipped past his teeth. He had actually gone to the trouble of typing up fake medical documents to frame me as an opportunistic kidnapper. It was a calculated, vicious move. If I reacted with anger or hysteria, I would play right into his narrative of being an unstable, dramatic daughter. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to fight so the police would see exactly what he described. Instead, I opened the door wide and stepped aside calmly. "Officers, please come in," I said, maintaining total composure. "My grandmother is right here in the living room. You are more than welcome to speak with her directly. But I must insist that this man stays out in the hallway. He is the reason she is in danger." My father scoffed loudly, attempting to push past the threshold. "I am her son, and her primary caregiver. You cannot keep me away from her." "Actually, sir, please remain in the hall for now," the second officer instructed, holding a firm hand up to stop my father from entering. "Let us assess the situation first." The officers stepped into my small living room, their heavy boots loud against the hardwood floor. Ruth was sitting upright on my sofa, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, holding her teacup. She looked tiny against the cushions, but her posture was rigid with absolute dignity. She had heard everything my father said through the open door. "Ma'am," the taller officer said gently, crouching down to her eye level to avoid intimidating her. "Can you tell me your full name and what year it is? We just want to make sure you are safe." Ruth set her teacup down on the coffee table with a deliberate, sharp clink. She looked the officer dead in the eye, her expression sharper than shattered glass. "My name is Ruth Evelyn Davies. It is 2026. The current president is in the White House, and I am sitting in my granddaughter Amber's apartment because my son Thomas drove me to Centennial Park, stole my purse, and abandoned me in a freezing rainstorm." The officers blinked, clearly taken aback by her sharp, articulate response. This was not the confused, dementia-riddled woman my father had just described in the hallway. Her voice was strong, clear, and completely unwavering. "Mom, your son claims you wandered off," the second officer said, glancing back at the open doorway where my father was hovering anxiously. "He says you have severe cognitive decline." Ruth let out a dry, bitter laugh that carried perfectly into the hall. "The only thing declining in my son is his moral compass. I do not have dementia. I manage my own finances. I live independently in my own home, and I renew my driver license every year without issue. Thomas brought me to the park tonight under the guise of taking me to a nice family dinner. When we arrived, he and his wife demanded I sign a power of attorney document, giving them total control of my pension fund to finance their new commercial real estate project." She pointed a steady, accusing finger toward the doorway where my father stood. When I refused to sign their fraudulent papers, he physically ripped my handbag from my shoulder. He told me the freezing cold would help me see reason. Then he drove his expensive car away and left me there to freeze to death. If my granddaughter had not found me, I would not have survived the night. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The officers stood up, their postures changing from concerned caretakers to strictly vigilant law enforcement. The taller officer turned around to look at the paperwork my father had handed him earlier. "These medical documents are undated and completely lack an official clinic letterhead," the officer noted, his voice hardening with realization. He walked back to the doorway and glared at my father. "Sir, you filed a police report claiming an abduction and a severe medical emergency. You presented documents claiming severe cognitive impairment." My father's smug confidence began to dissolve in real time. His face flushed a deep, ugly red as the officers cornered him with his own lies. "She is confused," he stammered, trying desperately to salvage his fabricated narrative. "She is covering for Amber. My daughter manipulated her into saying these things. You cannot possibly believe them over me. I am a respected business owner in this city." "Mr. Davies," the officer said sharply, stepping closer to my father, "your mother is perfectly lucid. She can recall exact details, dates, and locations with perfect clarity. She just clearly accused you of elder abuse, theft, and reckless endangerment. If anyone is going to be arrested tonight, it is going to be you." My father took a step back into the hallway, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. The realization that he had lost complete control of the narrative hit him incredibly hard. He was a man who relied entirely on his wealth and status to intimidate people into doing whatever he wanted. But right now, under the bright fluorescent lights of my apartment hallway, he was just a liar, caught in a very public, very humiliating trap. Do you wish to press charges for the stolen purse tonight, Mom? The second officer asked Ruth, pulling out a small notepad. Ruth looked at her son, her expression filled with a profound, exhausting sorrow. Not tonight, officer. I just want him to leave. I want him to leave and never come near me again. The taller officer stepped entirely out into the hallway and pointed firmly toward the elevators. You heard her. Leave the premises immediately. If you file another false report or waste city resources again, you will be taken into custody. If you return to this property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Do I make myself perfectly clear? My father opened his mouth to argue, but the stern, unforgiving look on the officer's face stopped him cold. He shot me a glare of pure, unfiltered hatred, a silent promise of absolute retribution. Without a single word, he turned on his heel and marched toward the elevators, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly on the tile floor. The officers stayed for another 20 minutes to take a formal written statement from Ruth regarding the incident at the park. They gave me their card and advised me to seek a permanent restraining order if my family attempted to contact her again. After they finally left, the apartment fell into a heavy, drained silence. I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the door, letting out a long, shaky breath. We had won the first battle, but I knew my family too well. Thomas and Sharon were not going to just walk away. They needed that pension money to secure their massive commercial development loan. They were desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. I walked back to the living room and sat beside Ruth. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the intense confrontation finally wearing off and leaving her looking every bit of her 82 years. I promised her she was safe, helped her into the guest bedroom, and sat alone in the dark living room, staring out at the streetlights shining through the wet window. I knew I needed to start securing her assets first thing in the morning. My father had her purse, which meant he had her identification, her debit cards, and possibly her checkbook. I needed to move fast to protect whatever capital she had left. Suddenly, my phone vibrated loudly on the coffee table, the bright screen illuminating the dark room. It was a text message from my younger sister, Brittany. I picked up the phone, feeling a familiar knot form in my stomach. Brittany was 29 years old, the pampered favorite, who had never worked a hard day in her entire life. She was the one my parents proudly funded, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into her failing lifestyle brand, while constantly calling my auditing career boring and worthless. I opened the message. The words glowing on the screen were dripping with entitlement and vicious rage. You are going to pay for making Dad look like a fool tonight. You think you are so smart, Amber? You think you can just swoop in and steal Grandma away to play the hero? I am coming over tomorrow morning, and I am taking what is ours. You better have her ready to go, or I will personally make your life a living nightmare. I stared at the text, feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my mind. They still thought I was the weak, compliant scapegoat they could bully into submission. They thought they could simply command me to surrender, and I would fold like I always did when we were younger. They had no idea that the scared girl they used to push around was gone. In her place was a financial auditor trained to dismantle corrupt corporate empires and expose massive fraud. If my sister wanted a war over our grandmother's money, she was going to get one. I locked my phone screen and opened my laptop, ready to show them exactly what a glorified calculator could do. I spent the remainder of the night sitting in the dark, my laptop glowing in front of me. I ran preliminary background searches on my father's business holdings, mapping out the structure of his various companies. I knew I needed to act fast, but I also needed a clear head to face the inevitable storm. I eventually closed the computer, checked on Ruth, who was sleeping soundly in the guest room, and managed to get a few hours of restless sleep on the living room couch. The fragile peace of the morning did not last long. At exactly 7 o'clock, a sharp, repetitive kicking echoed against the bottom of my front door frame. It was not a polite knock or even the aggressive pounding of the police from the night before. It was the petulant, demanding kick of someone who expected the world to instantly open up for them. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing in the hallway, wearing a designer cashmere trench coat and holding an oversized artisan coffee, was my 29-year-old sister, Brittany. She was kicking the toe of her expensive leather boot against my door, her face twisted in a scowl of pure annoyance. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door just enough to block her path, keeping my posture rigid. "Good morning, Brittany," I said coldly. Before I could say another word, she shoved her hand against the wood, forcing the door open and pushing her way into my apartment. She did not even take off her boots. She marched straight into the center of my living room, her nose wrinkling in visible disgust as she looked around my modest, practical space. She looked completely out of place, a walking advertisement for the luxury lifestyle brand our parents had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into funding. "This place is absolutely depressing," Amber Brittany said, taking a casual sip of her coffee. "I do not know how you live like this. It smells like cheap cleaning supplies and desperation." "Where is she?" I crossed my arms and stood between her and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "You are not seeing her," I stated simply. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my home before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Brittany rolled her eyes, completely unfazed by the threat. She had spent her entire life shielded from consequences, insulated by our parents' wealth and their endless willingness to fix her mistakes. "Please," she scoffed, "do not try to act tough. Dad told me what you did last night. You embarrassed him in front of the cops, and now Mom is stressed out. You are taking this completely out of proportion. We are leaving right now, and Grandma is coming with me." "She is not going anywhere with you," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "They abandoned her in a freezing park, Brittany. They stole her purse and left her to freeze because she refused to sign over her pension. That is elder abuse, and you are standing here defending it." Brittany let out a dramatic sigh, tossing her hair over her shoulder as if I was boring her. "You always exaggerate everything. Nobody abused anyone. Dad just needed her to sit outside and cool off so she would realize how much she needs us. She is being incredibly selfish, Amber. We are on the verge of something massive, and she is holding up the entire family over a stubborn technicality." I narrowed my eyes, my auditor instincts instantly catching the shift in her phrasing. "What do you mean you are on the verge of something massive?" Brittany looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. She had always believed I was too simple to understand high-level business, despite the fact that I held a master's degree in finance, while she had dropped out of a liberal arts program to become an influencer. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a grand secret with a subordinate. "Mom and Dad are securing a city contract for a massive commercial real estate development downtown," she explained, her eyes gleaming with greed. "It is a multi-million-dollar deal. It will put our family on the map permanently, but the city needs proof of immediate liquid capital before they finalize the tax breaks, and the bank requires collateral to approve the construction loan. We just need Grandma to sign over her pension routing numbers so the bank sees the liquidity. It is just on paper, Amber. It is a formality to secure the legacy." I stared at her, genuinely horrified by the casual way she discussed draining an 82-year-old woman's entire life savings. "You are going to use her pension as collateral for a commercial construction loan?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "If the development fails or goes over budget, the bank seizes her pension. She will be left with absolutely nothing. You are risking her survival for a real estate gamble." "It is not a gamble," Brittany snapped, her face flushing with irritation. "It is a guaranteed win. And even if it was a risk, it is family money. It belongs to all of us. You just do not get it because you have no vision. Just give her back. You are a glorified calculator, Amber. Do not ruin the family legacy just because you are bitter. You were never the favorite." The words hung in the air, thick with decades of toxic history. She genuinely believed that because I had chosen a practical career, because I lived within my means, because I refused to play their manipulative games, I was somehow lesser. She thought calling me a calculator was an insult. She did not realize that calculators do not feel intimidation, they only process hard facts. And the fact was, my sister and my parents were attempting to commit massive financial fraud. "My 30 seconds are up," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. "Get out of my apartment." Brittany planted her feet, raising her chin defiantly. "I am not leaving without her. You are going to go into that bedroom, pack her bags, and bring her out here right now. If you do not, Dad is going to make sure you never work in this city again. He will ruin your little accounting career." I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply closed the distance between us in two quick strides. I grabbed her firmly by the upper arm, my grip tight enough to let her know I was absolutely serious. Brittany gasped in shock, spilling a few drops of her expensive coffee onto the floor as I physically spun her around and marched her toward the front door. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, struggling against my grip. "Let go of me! You are crazy!" I shoved her out into the hallway with enough force to make her stumble. She caught her balance against the opposite wall, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. Nobody in our family had ever laid a hand on the golden child. Nobody had ever dared to physically force her to do anything. "If you or our parents ever set foot on my property again, I will have you arrested," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "Tell Thomas and Sharon that their glorified calculator is coming for them." I slammed the heavy door directly in her face. I immediately threw the deadbolt and engaged the chain lock. Through the thick wood, I could hear her screaming obscenities, kicking the door one last time before her angry footsteps faded down the hall toward the elevators. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, adrenaline pumping violently through my veins. The war had officially escalated. They were desperate for liquid capital, and they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. I hurried back into the living room and grabbed my laptop from the coffee table. I walked into the guest room where Ruth was already sitting up in bed looking deeply troubled. She had heard the entire exchange through the thin walls. "I am so sorry, Amber," she said quietly, her hands resting in her lap. "I never wanted to drag you into this ugliness." I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the laptop, booting up my secure network connection. "You did not drag me into anything, Grandma." "They did, and we are going to stop them. I need you to give me your online banking credentials right now. We are going to lock down your pension account, change the routing numbers, and put a freeze on any outgoing transfers. If they are this desperate for liquid capital to show the bank, they might try to access it through other means." Ruth nodded slowly, her expression grim. She recited her username and password from memory. She had always been sharp with her personal finances, keeping meticulous track of her modest but secure retirement funds. I navigated to the banking portal, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. I entered the credentials, bypassed the security prompts, and waited for the main dashboard to load. I was fully prepared to initiate an immediate security freeze. I was prepared to call the fraud department and lock the account down entirely. But as the page refreshed and the financial summary appeared on the screen, my heart completely stopped. I stared at the numbers, blinking hard, hoping it was a system error or a glitch in the display. A cold, nauseating dread washed over me, sinking deep into my bones. The available balance on Ruth's primary pension account read $0.00. I quickly clicked on the recent transaction history, my eyes scanning the digital ledger. There, sitting at the very top of the list, was the proof of my parents' absolute depravity. A massive unauthorized wire transfer draining every single cent of the pension had been successfully initiated at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. They had not waited for her to sign the papers. They had bypassed her entirely. I stared at the bright screen, the zeros burning into my retinas like a physical brand. A 3 o'clock in the morning wire transfer was not a standard banking procedure for a retirement account. It was a calculated, deliberate extraction. To bypass the bank fraud detection algorithms at that hour, whoever initiated the transfer had to possess my grandmother's highest-level security overrides, her passwords, her social security number, and her multi-factor authentication codes. My father had not just bullied her in a freezing park. He had systematically stolen her digital identity while she was trapped in the cold. My forensic auditor instincts immediately took over, overriding the initial shock. I pushed the panic down into a tight box in my chest and focused entirely on the data. I pulled up my specialized accounting software, the exact same high-level programs I used to dismantle corrupt corporate entities and trace embezzled funds. I needed to map the exact routing path of the stolen money before the capital could be dispersed, hidden across international lines, or converted into untraceable assets. My hands hovered over the keyboard, and then my fingers began to fly. I started pulling the transaction headers, examining the destination routing numbers attached to the clearinghouse data. While my screen processed the complex queries, I felt a gentle trembling hand rest on my shoulder. I turned my chair slightly away from the desk. Ruth had gotten out of the guest bed and was standing right beside me. She was wearing my oversized sweater, her eyes fixed on the empty bank balance displayed on the monitor. She did not cry. She did not break down. She simply looked profoundly, incredibly tired. "I'm going to get it back, Grandma," I promised her, my voice thick with absolute determination. "Every single cent. I will find where they moved it, and I will freeze the destination accounts before they can even touch the capital." Ruth slowly sat down on the edge of the sofa beside my workstation. She kept her hand firmly on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who had just survived a night in the freezing rain. "I am so sorry, Amber," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unspoken regrets. "I am so sorry for how this family has treated you." I sat back slightly, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. "You do not have to apologize for them," I told her gently. "I know exactly who they are. I made peace with their behavior a long time ago." "They treated you like a scapegoat your entire life," Ruth continued, her gaze unwavering. "Thomas and Sharon handed the world to Brittany on a silver platter. They funded her foolish lifestyle brand, paid for her luxury apartments, and praised her every breath. Meanwhile, they mocked your intelligence. They called you boring. They forced you to struggle and work multiple jobs just to pay for your education. I watched it happen, and I should have fought them harder. I should have protected you from their vanity." I shook my head, not wanting her to carry that guilt on top of everything else she was currently enduring. "You were the only one who ever showed me kindness," I reminded her. "You always listened to me when I talked about my studies. You made sure I knew I was smart, even when they told me I was just a disappointment. That was enough." Ruth offered a small, knowing smile, the sharp intelligence returning to her eyes. "True intelligence is a massive threat to people who rely entirely on manipulation to survive. I knew your brilliant analytical mind would be your greatest weapon against them one day. I knew you were going to be the one to finally hold them accountable. That is exactly why I paid for your exams." I froze, my hand slipping away from the keyboard. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process her words. "What do you mean you paid for my exams? When I was 24 years old, I was working two grueling jobs just to cover my basic rent. I was completely cut off from my parents' wealth because I had refused to join my father's questionable real estate firm. The registration fees for the certified public accountant exams and the specialized forensic auditing certifications were astronomically high. I had been saving for over a year, barely making a dent in the required amount. Out of nowhere, a massive anonymous educational grant had covered the entire cost, allowing me to take the tests, secure my licenses, and launch my corporate career. I had spent years wondering who had sponsored me. "It was you," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a wave of pure, overwhelming warmth. "You were the anonymous donor." Ruth patted my shoulder affectionately. "I could not let them stifle your potential, Amber. I saw how hard you were working. I saw the fire in you. I knew you were destined to be the one person in this family who could see right through their lies and dismantle their greed. You just needed the credentials to do it. Now use those credentials and find my money." I turned back to the screen, my resolve hardening into absolute steel. I was not just fighting for a vulnerable elderly woman anymore. I was fighting for the person who had silently funded my escape from my parents' toxic control. The person who had believed in my worth when my own mother and father had called me a useless failure. Brittany had called me a glorified calculator just minutes ago. I was going to show them exactly how dangerous a calculator could be when it was tallying up their crimes. The tracking software finally generated the routing report. The money had not been transferred directly into my parents' personal bank accounts, nor had it gone into their primary business accounts. That would have been far too obvious, too easily reversed by a standard banking fraud claim. Thomas had created a sophisticated financial labyrinth. He had routed the pension funds through a highly complex web of shell companies. I started peeling back the layers, cross-referencing the destination accounts with state business registries and corporate tax filings. The first wire transfer went to a blind holding company registered in Delaware. From there, the funds were immediately split into three smaller, less conspicuous transactions and wired to separate limited liability companies registered in Nevada and Wyoming. It was a classic money laundering technique designed to confuse automated banking monitors and hide the true origin of the liquid capital. But my father was arrogant, and arrogant men always make critical mistakes. He assumed no one would ever look closely enough to connect the dots. He used the exact same registered agent for all the shell companies, a cheap corporate filing service based out of a strip mall in Las Vegas. I spent the next 2 hours mapping out the entire corporate structure. I pulled public records, matched business identification numbers, and connected the phantom companies until they all converged into a single master banking account. The account was registered under the name Apex Urban Development Group, the exact commercial real estate entity my parents were pitching to the city council. They had effectively washed the stolen pension money through their fake companies to make it look like legitimate liquid capital provided by private investors. They needed to show the bank that they had millions in cash ready to deploy so they could secure the massive construction loans for the city contract. They built their entire family legacy on the money they stole from my grandmother while she was freezing in a park. I started compiling a comprehensive evidence binder right on my desktop. I took high-resolution screenshots of every transfer, logged every digital timestamp, and matched the shell company ownership records directly to my father's social security number. The forensic trail was completely undeniable. I had everything I needed to prove wire fraud, identity theft, and financial elder abuse. But as I was reviewing the final master ledger for their development group, scanning the columns of numbers to ensure I had not missed any hidden transactions, my eyes caught a strange anomaly in the data. There was a secondary recurring charge attached to the financial records that did not make any sense. It was not a deposit or a standard business expense. It was a massive auto draft payment being pulled every single month, funneling money out of the development group and sending it directly to a major national bank. I leaned closer to the screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. The payment was listed in the ledger as an interest disbursement, but it was attached directly to Ruth's personal tax identification number. That was impossible. Ruth had no outstanding debts. She had lived a frugal, careful life. I quickly pulled up her primary credit report, using the authorization she had just given me to cross-reference the strange interest charge. I waited as the credit bureau generated the file, the loading bar inching across the screen. When the report finally populated, my blood ran completely cold for the second time that morning. The interest payment was tied to a massive property loan. Specifically, it was an enormous line of credit secured directly against Ruth's historic, fully paid-off home. My parents had not stopped at stealing her pension. They had leveraged the very roof over her head. I sat completely frozen in my desk chair, my eyes glued to the credit report illuminating my monitor. A home equity line of credit is a financial product that allows a homeowner to borrow money against the equity of their house. For someone like my grandmother, who had worked her entire life to pay off her historic suburban home and live completely debt-free, a massive line of credit was absolute financial poison. But it was not just a small loan. The principal amount drawn against her property was staggering. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. I slowly turned to look at Ruth. She was sitting quietly on my sofa, still processing the shock of the stolen pension. I did not know how to tell her that the betrayal went even deeper. "Grandma," I started, my voice catching slightly in my throat. "Did you ever go to a bank with my father to take out a loan on your house?" Ruth looked at me, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "No, Amber. I paid off that mortgage 15 years ago. I have the physical deed sitting in my safe deposit box. Thomas asked me to take out a loan for his business last year, and I absolutely refused. I told him my home was my sanctuary, and I would never risk it for his real estate games. Why do you ask?" I swallowed, the bitter taste of disgust building in the back of my mouth. "Because they did not just steal your pension. They took out a massive line of credit against your house. The interest payments are bleeding out of their shell company to keep the bank from foreclosing, but the debt is entirely in your name. If their development project fails, the bank will seize your home. The color drained entirely from Ruth's face. The strong, resilient woman who had faced off against armed police officers just hours ago suddenly looked incredibly fragile. Her home was everything to her. It was where she had raised her children, where she had mourned my grandfather, and where she grew her prize-winning rose garden. Thomas and Sharon had leveraged the only safe place she had left in the world. I turned back to my laptop, a cold and calculated fury taking over my entire body. I was not just going to track the money anymore. I was going to find the exact mechanism they used to commit the fraud. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the County Recorder of Deeds public database. Since I worked as a financial auditor, navigating municipal property records was second nature to me. I entered the parcel identification number for Ruth's historic property and paid the small municipal fee to download the digitized copies of the most recent property filings. The high-resolution document loaded onto my screen. It was a 50-page commercial loan origination packet from a major national bank. I scrolled rapidly past the standard banking disclosures and the property appraisal reports until I reached the final signature pages. I zoomed in on the bottom line. There, in black ink, was my grandmother's signature. Or rather, a highly practiced, deliberate forgery of her signature. It was a good fake, but I had spent my entire life looking at birthday cards and handwritten letters from Ruth. The loop on the capital letters was too wide, and the pressure of the pen strokes was entirely too even. An 82-year-old woman writes with a slight natural tremor. This signature was smooth and aggressive. They had forged her name. I scrolled down to the notary public section of the document. The state notary stamp belonged to a man named Richard Vance. I did a quick search of his name in the state business registry and immediately found a match. Richard Vance was the primary real estate broker on payroll at my father's commercial firm. They had used an in-house employee to illegally notarize a forged banking document. This was no longer just elder abuse. It was a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. I looked at the disbursement routing instructions on the final page of the loan packet. The bank had wired the hundreds of thousands of dollars directly to a high-end architectural firm based in downtown Chicago. It all made sickening sense now. Thomas and Sharon needed preliminary architectural blueprints to pitch their commercial development to the city council, but those blueprints cost a fortune. They had forged a loan against Ruth's house to pay the architects, and then they stole her pension to show the city they had liquid capital to fund the actual construction. They had built their entire empire on the financial abuse of an elderly woman. I immediately hit the print command on my wireless printer, sending the forged property documents and the fraudulent notary stamps to the output tray. I needed hard physical copies of everything. I was building an undeniable paper trail that would dismantle my parents' entire lives. Just as the printer whirred to life, a loud chime echoed from my laptop speakers. A new email had just arrived in my primary inbox. I clicked over to my email client. The message was an automated public bulletin from the City Planning Commission. Because of my work as a municipal tax auditor, I was subscribed to all local government press releases and town hall agendas. I opened the email and read the bold text at the top of the digital newsletter. It was the official agenda for the upcoming Friday evening town hall meeting. Right there, listed as the headline presentation for the night, was Apex Urban Development Group. Thomas and Sharon were scheduled to stand in front of the mayor, the city council, and a room full of wealthy private investors to formally present their commercial development project. The agenda noted that the group was seeking massive municipal tax breaks and exclusive zoning permits for a multi-million-dollar city contract. The description of the project made my stomach turn. It was marketed as a family-focused community initiative designed to bring prosperity to the suburbs. My parents were going to stand at a podium, project their stolen blueprints onto a screen, and use my grandmother's stolen pension to prove they were wealthy, upstanding community leaders. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They were going to lock down a city contract using stolen assets, and once the city approved the deal, the commercial bank would release the massive construction loans. By the time anyone realized what had happened, my parents would have millions in legitimate funding and would be entirely untouchable. I looked at the date on the email. The town hall meeting was less than 48 hours away. I turned to Ruth, holding up the freshly printed stack of forged documents. "They are presenting the project to the city council this Friday night," I told her. "They are going to use your money to close the deal. We need to find a lawyer right now. We have to file an emergency injunction and freeze their business accounts before they can step foot in that municipal building." Ruth nodded slowly, her jaw set with grim determination. I stood up from my desk, fully intending to start calling every aggressive corporate litigator I knew in the greater Chicago area. But before I could even pick up my phone, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through my apartment. It was not the frantic kicking my sister Brittany had done earlier that morning. It was rhythmic, professional, and entirely unyielding. I walked cautiously to the front door, my muscles tensing. I checked the peephole. A tall man in a plain gray suit was standing in the hallway holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look like a police officer, and he certainly was not anyone from my family. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, keeping the security chain engaged. "Are you Amber Davies?" the man asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Yes, I am," I replied cautiously. The man slid the thick manila envelope through the narrow gap in the doorway. "You have been served," he stated flatly. He turned on his heel and walked away down the corridor without another word. I closed the door, my hands trembling slightly as I ripped open the top of the envelope. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the official seal of the county probate court. I scanned the bold text at the top of the first page, and my breath caught painfully in my throat. It was an official court summons for an emergency legal hearing. Thomas and Sharon had not just been sitting idly by after I kicked Brittany out of my apartment. They had gone straight to the most expensive probate law firm in the city. The document in my hands was a formal petition for an emergency conservatorship. My parents had filed legal motions to have Ruth declared legally mentally incompetent by a judge. They were demanding the court grant them immediate total control over her medical decisions, her physical location, and every single remaining asset to her name. If they won, Ruth would essentially lose her basic human rights. She would become a ward of the state managed entirely by her abusers. They could put her in a locked facility and legally sell her house to cover their debts without anyone being able to stop them. I looked at the scheduled date on the legal summons. The emergency probate hearing was set for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We had less than 24 hours to build a defense that would stop my parents from legally kidnapping my grandmother. I stared at the thick stack of legal papers in my hands, gripping the edges so tightly that the paper began to crumple under my fingers. The bold black letters printed at the top of the petition spelled out my grandmother's total loss of freedom. It was a petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship. As a financial auditor, I spent my life reading dense legal contracts, and I easily translated the terrifying reality of what my parents were attempting to do. They were not just asking the court for temporary control of her finances. They were formally asking a judge to strip Ruth of her basic human rights. If the judge granted this emergency motion tomorrow morning, Thomas and Sharon would become her absolute legal guardians. They would instantly gain the power to decide where she lived, what doctors she saw, and what medications she took. They could legally lock her inside a secure memory care facility against her will and restrict anyone, including me, from ever visiting her again. They could legally sell her historic home to cover the massive fraudulent line of credit they had secretly taken out, and the law would completely protect them. They would effectively erase her identity and silence her forever to cover up their massive financial crimes. I looked over at Ruth. She was watching my face carefully, her posture stiff with apprehension. "What is it, Amber?" she asked, her voice tight with genuine worry. "What did my son do now?" I sat down next to her on the sofa and explained exactly what the court summons meant. I did not sugarcoat the extreme danger we were in, but I also refused to let panic dictate our next move. "They want a judge to declare you legally incompetent," I told her firmly. But we are going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning and prove that you are sharper than all of them combined. I need you to gather every single piece of medical paperwork you have brought with you in that plastic bag. I need your doctor's contact information, your recent prescription lists, and absolutely anything else that proves you manage your own daily life independently. For the next 14 hours, my small apartment transformed into a hostile legal war room. I cleared everything off my dining room table and started building a massive comprehensive defense binder. I knew from my professional experience that judges did not care about emotional appeals or messy family drama. They cared about hard, verifiable evidence. I printed out the daily logs of Ruth's independent living expenses, showing she paid her own utility bills on time every single month. I compiled a detailed list of character references from her neighbors, her book club members, and the local grocer who saw her perfectly alert and capable every single week. I then organized the banking statements highlighting the exact timestamp of the 3 o'clock in the morning wire transfer. I needed to show the court that Thomas was the one engaging in erratic predatory behavior, not Ruth. I drank 3 cups of black coffee, my eyes burning as I cross-referenced the state probate laws. I needed to show the judge that this emergency petition was not an act of familial concern, but a desperate, calculated move to cover up a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. I printed the forged property loan documents, highlighting the fake notary stamp from my father's employee, and placed them all in a bright red folder. I was going to bury their highly paid lawyers in a mountain of undeniable forensic accounting evidence. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Ruth had finally fallen asleep in the guest room. I was sitting on the floor surrounded by highlighters and printed spreadsheets when my cell phone vibrated loudly on the coffee table. The caller identification showed an unknown local number. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was a spam call, but the tense reality of our situation made me overly cautious. I accepted the call and brought the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Hello, Amber," my sister Brittany said, her voice dripping with venomous, arrogant satisfaction. "Did you get the special delivery we sent you tonight?" I kept my breathing slow and completely even. "How did you get this number, Brittany? I blocked you this morning." She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed unpleasantly through the phone speaker. "You really think blocking my number is going to protect you? Dad has financial resources you cannot even begin to comprehend. We hired the most expensive probate law firm in the entire city of Chicago. They have teams of investigators whose entire job is to destroy little pests like you. They found your unlisted phone number in 5 minutes. You are completely out of your league," Brittany continued, her tone shifting from mocking to overtly threatening. "You think your little boring accounting degree is going to save you in a real courtroom? Our lawyers are going to walk in there tomorrow and paint you as an unstable, estranged granddaughter who kidnapped a vulnerable old woman just to steal her money. They are going to obliterate your professional reputation. And when the judge grants Dad full conservatorship over Grandma, we are going to sue you for every single penny of our exorbitant legal fees. You will be completely bankrupt before the month is over." I listened to her unhinged rant, analyzing her words for any strategic advantage. She was clearly trying to intimidate me into not showing up at the courthouse. She wanted me to surrender out of a fear of financial ruin and professional embarrassment. She assumed I was as easily manipulated as I had been when we were teenagers living under our parents' roof. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Brittany scoffed loudly, clearly annoyed that I was not crying or begging for mercy. "You are going to lose everything, Amber. Just bring her to the courthouse tomorrow and hand her over peacefully to Dad. It will save you a lifetime of crippling debt." "I am bringing her to the courthouse," I replied coldly, "but I am also bringing a very detailed, heavily documented forensic audit of the fake shell companies Thomas used to launder her pension funds. Tell your incredibly expensive lawyers to brush up on federal wire fraud statutes. I will see you in the morning." I hung up the phone immediately and blocked the new number. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my resolve was absolute. They were terrified of what I might do, which meant they knew exactly how fragile their criminal enterprise really was. They were relying entirely on intimidation because their actual legal standing was built on blatant forgery. The sun finally rose over Chicago, casting a harsh gray light through my apartment windows. I had not slept a single minute. I took a quick shower dressed in my sharpest, most professional navy blue business suit and helped Ruth get ready for the most important day of her life. She wore a tailored wool blazer and styled her silver hair impeccably. She did not look like a woman suffering from severe cognitive decline. She looked like a fierce, distinguished matriarch ready to reclaim her stolen life. We drove downtown to the county courthouse together in heavy morning traffic. The imposing stone architecture of the municipal building loomed over the city streets, serving as a massive physical representation of the legal battle we were about to fight. We passed through the strict security checkpoints, removing our coats and placing my heavy evidence binder on the scanning belt. We rode the crowded elevator up to the probate division on the 4th floor in complete silence. I held my evidence binder tightly against my chest, silently rehearsing my opening arguments and preparing to dismantle my father's lies with pure financial data. We found the correct courtroom at the end of a long, polished hallway. I approached the glass-enclosed scheduling bulletin board mounted on the wall outside the heavy oak doors. I scanned the printed list of emergency hearings for the morning, tracking my finger down the paper until I located Ruth's case number. Then I looked at the name of the judge presiding over our specific hearing. A sudden, sickening wave of absolute dread crashed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. I recognized the judge's name immediately from my years of conducting municipal audits for the city. He was not an impartial magistrate. He was a former senior partner at the exact same high-priced law firm my father had just hired to destroy us. He still attended their corporate galas and golfed with their senior litigators. The deck was not just stacked against us. The entire legal game was rigged from the very start. I stared at the brass nameplate mounted on the wall beside the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B. The name of the presiding magistrate, Judge Harrison, was etched in sharp, unforgiving letters. The sudden wave of nausea that hit me had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the realization that my parents had rigged the entire game. From my years of conducting municipal tax audits for the city of Chicago, I knew exactly who Judge Harrison was. Before taking the bench, he had been a senior managing partner at the exact same luxury probate law firm my father had just hired to destroy us. He still attended their exclusive corporate galas and regularly golfed with their senior litigators. I was not walking into a fair and impartial court of law. I was walking into a calculated ambush. I forced myself to take a deep, stabilizing breath. I could not let Ruth see the panic threatening to paralyze me. I turned to my grandmother, offering her a reassuring smile that took every ounce of my willpower to maintain. I linked my arm gently through hers, feeling the slight tremor in her hands, and guided her through the heavy wooden doors and into the sterile, imposing courtroom. We took our seats at the respondent table just as my family made their grand entrance. Thomas, Sharon, and my sister Brittany walked down the center aisle, and their performance was absolutely nauseating. They had completely abandoned the arrogant, vicious demeanor they had displayed over the past 48 hours. Instead, they were playing the roles of a deeply traumatized, heartbroken family. Sharon was dabbing the corners of her eyes with a pristine white tissue, her face arranged in a mask of profound sorrow. Brittany held our mother's arm, looking down at the floor like a devoted daughter overwhelmed by a family tragedy. My father walked with his shoulders slightly slumped, playing the part of a burdened son, forced to make a terrible decision for the good of his declining mother. They were accompanied by a man in a bespoke charcoal suit who radiated aggressive corporate power. This was Mr. Gallagher, the lead probate litigator they had hired to obliterate us. He set his thick leather briefcase down at the petitioner table with a heavy, authoritative thud. When Judge Harrison entered the courtroom and took his seat at the elevated bench, the air in the room grew instantly suffocating. He barely glanced at me or Ruth, his eyes immediately finding Mr. Gallagher with a look of familiar professional recognition. Mr. Gallagher stood up to deliver his opening statement, and within 60 seconds he managed to twist reality into an unrecognizable nightmare. "Your Honor." Mr. Gallagher began, his voice dripping with practiced synthetic empathy. "We are here today under the most tragic of circumstances. My clients Thomas and Sharon are forced to seek emergency legal guardianship of their beloved mother and grandmother Ruth. Over the past several months, Ruth has suffered a catastrophic and rapid cognitive decline. She is no longer capable of managing her own daily affairs, her finances, or her physical safety. This situation reached a critical breaking point 2 nights ago when she wandered away from a family dinner in a state of severe confusion and was found wandering aimlessly in a freezing city park. I gripped my pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were completely rewriting the narrative of the abandonment. They were using the freezing rain and the stolen purse as proof of her dementia rather than their own criminal abuse. Mr. Gallagher approached the bench and handed a thick, professionally bound document to the judge. We have submitted a comprehensive medical evaluation conducted just yesterday by a top-tier concierge neurologist in the city. The diagnosis is definitive and tragic. Ruth is suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's disease, accompanied by severe sundowning and cognitive detachment. The physician strongly recommends an immediate transfer to a secure locked memory care facility to prevent her from accidentally harming herself or falling victim to financial exploitation. I stared at the medical document in the judge's hands, my blood boiling with absolute outrage. The evaluation was entirely falsified, procured through one of Brittany's corrupt medical school connections. They had paid top dollar for a completely fake diagnosis from a doctor who had never even met my grandmother in person. The document was meticulously detailed, listing fabricated symptoms, fake memory test failures, and falsified behavioral reports. It looked incredibly official, designed specifically to overwhelm the court with medical authority. Judge Harrison reviewed the fake medical file, nodding slowly with an expression of grave concern. This is a very thorough and deeply troubling medical assessment, Mr. Gallagher, the judge noted, completely ignoring the fact that the ink on the evaluation was barely dry. But Mr. Gallagher was not finished. Having established the fake medical baseline, he turned his predatory focus entirely onto me. He walked slowly back to his table and pointed an accusing finger in my direction. The tragedy of Ruth's cognitive decline is unfortunately only half of the emergency before this court today. Your Honor, Mr. Gallagher continued, his tone turning sharp and aggressive. The respondent sitting at that table, Amber, is the estranged granddaughter of my clients. She is a financially unstable woman who has a documented history of resentment toward this family. 2 nights ago, when Ruth wandered off in a state of confusion, Amber found her. But instead of returning her to her primary caregivers, Amber essentially abducted this vulnerable elderly woman. She locked her inside a modest, unsecured apartment and physically barred my clients from checking on her well-being. Sharon let out a soft, theatrical sob from her seat, pressing the tissue to her face. Brittany wrapped an arm around her mother, glaring at me with a look of pure, vicious triumph. Amber is an opportunistic predator, Your Honor, Mr. Gallagher stated loudly, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She is attempting to isolate a woman with severe dementia in order to gain access to her retirement accounts. We are asking the court to grant immediate emergency conservatorship to my clients to protect Ruth from further exploitation and to ensure she receives the locked full-time medical care she so desperately needs. I felt Ruth's hand grab my wrist under the table. She was trembling with indignation, completely horrified by the lies being spoken about her own mind. She opened her mouth to speak to defend her own sanity, but I gently squeezed her hand to stop her. If she spoke out of turn or showed any signs of anger, Mr. Gallagher would immediately use it as proof of her supposed emotional instability. It was my turn to fight. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy blue suit, and picked up my heavy red evidence binder. I walked to the center podium, meeting the judge's dismissive gaze with unwavering professional authority. Your Honor, every single word spoken by the petitioner's counsel today is a calculated, verifiable lie. I stated clearly, my voice projecting across the courtroom. I am a certified financial auditor for the state of Illinois. I deal exclusively in hard facts and undeniable data. My grandmother does not have Alzheimer's disease. She does not have dementia. The medical document presented to this court is a complete fabrication purchased by my father to facilitate a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. Judge Harrison frowned heavily, clearly annoyed by my direct challenge. Miss Davies, you are making some incredibly serious allegations against a respected law firm and a licensed medical professional. You better have the evidence to back up this kind of aggressive rhetoric in my courtroom. I opened my red binder and pulled out the daily logs, the bank statements, and the character references. I submit to the court 5 years of daily independent living records, I said, handing the stack of papers to the bailiff to pass to the bench. Ruth pays her own utilities on time every month. I have provided signed affidavits from her local bank manager, her grocer, and her neighbors, who interact with her daily. They all attest to her absolute cognitive clarity. Furthermore, she was not wandering confused in a park. My father drove her to Centennial Park and physically stole her purse because she refused to sign over her pension fund to finance his new commercial real estate project. Mr. Gallagher immediately jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The respondent is using wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories to distract from the official medical diagnosis. She is not a doctor. She cannot dispute a neurological evaluation with grocery store receipts. I ignored the objection and pulled out the high-resolution screenshots of the 3:00 in the morning wire transfers and the forged home equity line of credit documents. I have the financial proof right here, Your Honor, I said, holding the documents up high. At exactly 3 in the morning, while my grandmother was recovering in my apartment from being abandoned in the freezing rain, my father illegally wired her entire pension into a web of corporate shell companies. He also forged her signature on a massive property loan to pay for architectural blueprints. This is not a rescue mission. This emergency conservatorship is a desperate legal shield to cover up massive wire fraud and elder abuse. I stepped forward, trying to hand the financial records to the bailiff. If you look at the routing numbers, you will see the exact flow of the stolen capital. Judge Harrison raised a hand, stopping the bailiff from taking my documents. He looked down at me with a cold, highly irritated expression. Miss Davies, I am going to stop you right there. You seem to be profoundly confused about the nature of this venue. This is a probate court handling an emergency petition regarding medical competency and physical safety. This is not a civil fraud tribunal or a criminal court. But, Your Honor, the financial theft proves the motive behind the fake medical documents, I argued, my voice rising with desperate urgency. They are trying to declare her incompetent so she cannot testify against them for stealing her money. If you believe a financial crime has been committed, you are free to file a police report with the proper authorities, Judge Harrison stated callously, leaning back in his leather chair. I did, I shot back. My father lied to the police officers right in my hallway. Judge Harrison slammed his hand flat against the desk. I will not tolerate outbursts in my courtroom, Miss Davies. I have an official signed evaluation from a licensed medical specialist declaring that this elderly woman is in imminent danger due to severe cognitive failure. You have handed me utility bills and character references from a book club. You are asking me to ignore expert medical testimony based on your personal financial spreadsheets, and I will not do it. When it comes to the immediate safety of a vulnerable senior citizen, the court must err on the side of caution. I stood frozen at the podium, a cold, suffocating realization washing over me. He was deliberately using procedural rules to block my evidence. Because it was an emergency medical hearing, he was legally permitted to dismiss the financial fraud as a separate civil issue. He was giving my father exactly what he paid for. Judge Harrison looked down at the fake medical file one last time, adjusting his glasses. The narrative presented by the petitioners, backed by expert medical opinion, raises severe concerns about Ruth's immediate welfare. I have heard enough to make a preliminary ruling. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel. I watched his hand close around the handle, knowing that the second it struck the sounding block, my grandmother would lose everything. Her freedom, her home, her voice. The trap had perfectly closed around us, and the judge was preparing to deliver the final devastating blow. The heavy wooden gavel came crashing down against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing through the dead silence of the courtroom. The sound felt like a physical blow to my chest. Judge Harrison settled back into his high-backed leather chair, looking down at us with a completely dispassionate expression. He had made his decision and he was fully prepared to deliver my family exactly what they had paid for. Based on the expert medical testimony provided by the petitioners today, I find sufficient cause to intervene on behalf of this vulnerable senior citizen. The judge announced, his voice projecting clearly across the room. The court cannot in good conscience ignore a formal diagnosis of late-stage cognitive failure. Therefore, I am granting the emergency motion for a temporary protective order. I stood frozen at the respondent table, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I tried to interject to point once again to the undeniable financial records sitting right in front of him, but he raised a hand to silence me before I could even speak. I am ordering an immediate comprehensive freeze on all personal banking assets, retirement accounts, and liquid capital directly tied to Ruth Evelyn Davies. Judge Harrison continued reading from his prepared order. This temporary freeze will remain in absolute effect until a full comprehensive medical competency hearing can be convened in exactly 14 days. Until that time, the respondent is strictly prohibited from altering, transferring, or accessing her personal financial portfolios. The injustice of the ruling was absolutely suffocating. He was completely stripping my grandmother of her financial independence based on a fraudulent piece of paper signed by a corrupt doctor. By freezing her accounts, the court was leaving Ruth entirely reliant on my personal income for the next 2 weeks. We would have to buy her groceries, pay for her medications, and fund our legal defense using only my salary, while my parents faced absolutely zero immediate consequences for stealing her pension. Furthermore, the judge added, his tone growing even colder, I am denying the respondent's motion to investigate the recent financial transfers. The petitioners have demonstrated that they are acting in good faith as concerned family members trying to secure assets on behalf of a declining relative. Any allegations of wire fraud or elder abuse are hereby dismissed from this emergency venue. I turned to look at the petitioner table. My father Thomas was looking at his high-priced attorney, Mr. Gallagher, with a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk. Brittany visibly relaxed her posture, leaning back in her chair as a victorious, vicious sneer pulled at the corners of her mouth. They had won. They had manipulated the legal system flawlessly, using a corrupt judge to buy themselves the exact window of time they needed to secure their multi-million-dollar city contract. The bailiff formally dismissed the courtroom, and the tension in the air broke into a flurry of movement. I was forced to pack up my defense materials while my family openly celebrated their legal victory just a few feet away. I placed my useless forensic accounting spreadsheets back into my heavy red evidence binder, my hands trembling with a mixture of suppressed rage and profound exhaustion. I carefully helped Ruth stand up from her chair at the table. She looked incredibly drained. The emotional toll of sitting completely silent while a room full of strangers debated her sanity was weighing heavily on her small frame. I wrapped my arms securely around hers and promised her we were not done fighting. We walked slowly down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy oak doors and leaving the oppressive atmosphere of courtroom 4B behind us. Out in the vast marble-floored hallway of the county courthouse, the air was cold and echoey. Dozens of lawyers and clients rushed past us, completely unaware of the devastating injustice that had just occurred. I was guiding Ruth toward the main bank of elevators, desperate to get her out of the building and back to the safety of my apartment when my mother suddenly broke away from her legal team. Sharon stepped directly into our path, intentionally blocking our way to the exit. Her performance as the weeping, heartbroken daughter-in-law vanished the exact second she was out of the judge's sight. Her posture straightened, her fake tears dried instantly, and her face twisted into a mask of pure malicious triumph. She leaned in close, invading my personal space. Her expensive designer perfume clashed violently with the sterile administrative smell of the courthouse corridor. "You lose again," Sharon whispered, her voice laced with absolute venom. "By the time that full competency hearing happens in 2 weeks, the city contract will be entirely ours. We will have the commercial development rights, secured the massive bank loans finalized, and we will have absolute legal control over everything she owns." I glared at her, refusing to break eye contact or show any sign of intimidation. You built this entire project on forgery and theft, I replied quietly. You will never get away with it. Sharon let out a low, mocking laugh. We already have Amber. The judge gave us everything we asked for. You really thought you could outsmart us just because you know how to read a bank statement. You are nothing but a minor inconvenience. Go back to your spreadsheets. You are completely out of your league. She turned on her heel and walked back down the hallway to join Thomas and Brittany. They stood together near the elevators, looking like a flawless, wealthy family. They laughed quietly among themselves as the elevator doors slid open, stepping inside and disappearing from view. I stood in the hallway watching the digital floor indicator tick downward as they descended to the lobby. My jaw was clenched so tightly that my teeth literally ached. I was absolutely seething, my blood boiling with a need for immediate destructive retribution. They thought they had backed us into an inescapable corner. They thought they had stripped us of all our resources and left us completely defenseless. I guided Ruth to a wooden bench set against the marble wall and sat down beside her. I needed a moment to gather my thoughts before we made the drive back to the suburbs. I opened my red evidence binder and pulled out the freshly printed copy of Judge Harrison's temporary freeze order. The court clerk had handed it to me as we exited the room. I refused to accept total defeat. I am a specialized financial auditor, and my entire professional career is built on finding hidden loopholes, anomalies, and structural weaknesses in highly complex legal documents. I smoothed the paper out on my lap and began to read through the dense legal jargon. I scanned every single paragraph, every clause, and every stipulation with absolute clinical focus. My eyes darted across the page, tracing the exact legal boundaries the corrupt judge had drawn around my grandmother's life. I reached the specific parameters of the asset freeze on the second page. I read the sentence once. I read it a second time. I read it a third time just to ensure I was not hallucinating out of pure desperation. A sudden electric jolt of pure adrenaline rushed through my veins, chasing away the exhaustion and replacing it with razor-sharp clarity. The corrupt judge had made a massive fatal error in his phrasing. Because Mr. Gallagher had focused entirely on restricting my access to Ruth's personal checking accounts and pension funds, the court order was explicitly narrow. The ruling stated that the freeze applied exclusively to personal banking assets and individual retirement portfolios. It did not contain a single provision regarding corporate holdings, blind trusts, or commercial business equities. The legal freeze only applied to her personal identity as a private citizen. As far as the state of Illinois was concerned, if Ruth controlled any corporate entities, those entities were still fully operational and completely unfrozen. My parents and their expensive lawyers had been so hyper-focused on stealing her personal cash that they completely failed to lock down her broader financial rights. They had left a massive glaring loophole right in the middle of their perfect legal trap. I slowly looked up from the court order, a cold, highly calculated smile spreading across my face. The panic was entirely gone, replaced by a thrilling sense of predatory anticipation. I turned to my grandmother, who was watching my sudden change in demeanor with curious eyes. They locked down your checking accounts and your personal savings, I told her softly, tapping my finger against the legal document. But they used very specific language. They left the corporate door wide open. I closed the red evidence binder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed down the quiet courthouse hallway. We need a lawyer who fights dirtier than theirs, I said, my voice filled with renewed determination. We need someone who does not care about family court politics and only cares about destroying corporate contracts. Ruth sat up a little straighter on the wooden bench. The tired, overwhelmed look vanished from her eyes, entirely replaced by the fierce, brilliant spark I had always admired in her. She smiled knowingly, her sharp intellect returning in full force. She leaned closer to me, lowering her voice so no one passing by could hear us. She looked me dead in the eye and gave me a name. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. We left the county courthouse behind us, trading the suffocating administrative corridors for the towering glass and steel canyons of downtown Chicago. I navigated the heavy midday traffic with a singular burning focus. My father thought he had won by trapping us in the slow, emotional swamp of family court. He had used a corrupt judge to freeze my grandmother's personal checking accounts, assuming that without liquid cash, we were entirely powerless. But he had fundamentally misunderstood how wealth and power actually operated in this city. Personal money was just pocket change, corporate assets were the real weapons, and I knew exactly who to call to wield them. We arrived at a sleek 70-story skyscraper overlooking the Chicago River. I guided Ruth through the polished marble lobby and straight into the private executive elevator bank. We rode up to the top floor, stepping out into the hushed, hyper-expensive reception area of Vanguard Legal Partners. This was not a firm that handled messy divorces or squabbles over family wills. This was a firm of corporate assassins. They specialized in hostile takeovers, dismantling multinational conglomerates, and burying white-collar criminals under mountains of impenetrable litigation. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman with an icy demeanor, looked up from her dual monitors as we approached the desk. I did not ask for an appointment. I simply placed my business card on the pristine glass counter. "Tell Mitchell that Amber Davies is here," I said evenly. "And tell him I am cashing in my favor." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly accustomed to turning away desperate walk-ins, but she picked up her desk phone and relayed the message. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy frosted glass doors behind her swung open. Mitchell walked out to greet us personally. He was a tall man in his late 40s wearing a tailored suit that projected absolute authority. He possessed the kind of ruthless, calculating energy that made most opposing counsel fold before a trial even began. But when he saw me standing there with Ruth, his sharp features softened into a look of absolute, genuine respect. 3 years ago, Mitchell's entire firm had been on the brink of catastrophic ruin due to a highly sophisticated internal embezzlement ring. I had been brought in as an independent financial auditor. I spent 3 grueling weeks dissecting their encrypted ledgers, eventually tracing the stolen funds, and saving the firm from total collapse and federal indictment. Mitchell had shaken my hand that day and promised that if I ever needed a legal nuclear strike, he would provide the launch codes. "Amber, it has been too long," Mitchell said, gesturing for us to follow him. "Cancel all my afternoon meetings," he threw over his shoulder to the receptionist. "I am completely unavailable for the rest of the day." He led us into his massive corner office, which featured panoramic views of the city skyline and a conference table carved from a single slab of dark walnut. He offered Ruth a comfortable leather chair and had his assistant bring her a glass of sparkling water. Then he turned his full predatory attention to me, leaning back against the edge of his desk. "What kind of war are we fighting today?" he asked. I did not waste time with emotional pleasantries. I dropped my heavy red evidence binder right in the center of his immaculate desk. I opened it and laid out the entire timeline of my family's criminal enterprise. I showed him the 3 a.m. wire transfers that drained Ruth's pension. I showed him the forged home equity line of credit documents pointing out the fake notary stamp provided by my father's employee. I explained how my parents had ambushed us in family court that morning with a purchased fraudulent medical diagnosis of late-stage Alzheimer's disease. I detailed how a corrupt probate judge had deliberately blocked my financial evidence to grant them a temporary asset freeze, leaving my grandmother entirely dependent on my salary while they walked away with her life savings. Mitchell flipped through the forged property documents, his eyes darting across the pages with terrifying speed. His jaw tightened as he recognized the blatant illegalities my father had committed. "This is incredibly sloppy," he noted, tracing the forged signature with his heavy brass pen. "It is purely arrogant. They are relying entirely on the assumption that an elderly woman would not have the resources or the mental capacity to fight back. They engineered a family court emergency to blindside you and drain the capital before anyone could audit their books." "Exactly," I agreed, leaning over the table. "But they made a fatal mistake. The judge only froze her personal banking accounts. They left her corporate identity completely untouched. My parents are presenting their new commercial real estate development project to the mayor and the city council tomorrow night at the municipal town hall meeting. They are going to use my grandmother's stolen pension to prove they have the liquid capital necessary to secure massive municipal tax breaks and a commercial construction loan. I tapped the red folder emphatically. I do not want to fight them in a slow probate court while they freely spend her money. I want to obliterate their commercial development deal publicly before they can even sign the city contract. I need a corporate angle to destroy them completely. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. You definitely came to the right place. Let us look at what your father is actually trying to build. He turned to his massive desktop computer and logged directly into the city's secure commercial zoning and land registry databases. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up the public filings for Apex Urban Development Group, the shell company my father was using to pitch his project. We watched the massive wall-mounted monitor as the digital property deeds loaded. Mitchell pulled the title records for the massive downtown city block my father was attempting to rezone and develop. The documents outlined a massive commercial lease agreement. My father did not own the land he was building on. He was merely leasing the development rights from a private third party holding trust. We just need to find a vulnerability in this lease agreement, Mitchell muttered, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. If we can prove fraudulent intent or a breach of covenant with the landlord, we can petition to have the development rights revoked. He clicked through the layers of corporate ownership attached to that specific holding trust, tracing the original deed back decades to see who actually controlled the property. He navigated past the anonymized corporate registrars and the blind trust protectors, digging into the foundational incorporation documents. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard died away, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence in the large office. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He read the screen once, then scrolled back to the top and read it again. He slowly turned his head away from the monitors to look directly at my grandmother, who was sitting quietly in the leather armchair, sipping her water. Ruth, Mitchell said, his voice stripped of all its usual corporate bravado, shifting into a tone of absolute bewilderment. Why does your late husband's old blind trust match the title deed for this entire city block? The heavy, stunned silence in Mitchell's expansive corner office was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic drifting up from 70 floors below. Mitchell was a man who dismantled corrupt corporate empires for a living, a legal shark who was never caught off guard. Yet he was staring at his glowing computer monitor with his mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed by the digital property deeds displayed on the screen. He slowly turned his chair away from the desk and looked directly at my grandmother. Ruth, he said, his voice completely stripped of its usual corporate bravado. Why does your late husband's old blind trust match the title deed for this entire city block? I stood frozen beside the conference table, my financial auditor brain racing to process the sheer magnitude of what Mitchell was implying. I walked quickly over to his desk and leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted land registry files he had just uncovered. There it was, buried under layers of ironclad corporate shielding. The massive tract of downtown commercial real estate that my parents were attempting to rezone and develop was owned by a massive holding trust named Apex Holdings. And sitting at the very top of that corporate structure, listed as the sole controlling shareholder and primary executive, was Ruth Evelyn Davies. I turned to look at my grandmother. She was sitting comfortably in the plush leather armchair, her posture relaxed and perfectly composed. She picked up her glass of sparkling water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the coaster. Because my husband was an incredibly brilliant man, Mitchell, she answered, her voice calm and remarkably steady. And because we always knew exactly what kind of monster our son was destined to become. Mitchell let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like a gasp of pure disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. You own the land, he stated, shaking his head. Thomas is trying to build a $50 million commercial plaza, and he is leasing the development rights directly from his own mother. Ruth nodded, a sharp, cold intelligence shining in her eyes. Thomas has spent his entire adult life absolutely obsessed with projecting wealth and securing social status. He always viewed my modest, quiet lifestyle in the suburbs as a weakness. He assumed that because I enjoyed gardening and baking, I was simple-minded and financially illiterate. My late husband built a massive commercial real estate portfolio decades ago, but he deliberately structured it through anonymous holding trusts to protect our privacy. When he passed away, full control of Apex Holdings transferred directly to me. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression hardening into absolute steel. I knew Thomas would come for my money eventually. Greed is a disease that completely rots the mind, and my son is terminally infected. He and Sharon burned through cash to maintain their lavish lifestyle and to fund Brittany's endless foolish vanity projects. I knew that the second they faced real financial pressure, they would look at me as an easy target. I stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly slamming together in my mind with staggering clarity. The pension, I whispered, realizing the sheer genius of her strategy. The pension fund and the historic house, you left them completely unshielded on purpose. Ruth turned to me and offered a tight, solemn smile. They were decoys, Amber. I left my personal checking accounts, my modest pension, and the deed to my suburban home in my personal name. I knew that if Thomas ever grew truly desperate for liquid capital, he would come for the visible assets. They were the sacrificial lambs. I let him think he was outsmarting an old woman. It kept him looking the other way, completely oblivious to the real family wealth protected inside the corporate trust. I gave him just enough rope to hang himself. I was absolutely speechless. As a specialized forensic auditor, I spent my entire career unraveling complex financial strategies, but I had never seen a defensive trap executed with such flawless precision. My grandmother had anticipated my parents' predatory behavior years in advance and had constructed a perfect financial fortress. "But I never thought he would be so cruel," Ruth continued, her voice dropping to a harsh, painful whisper. "I thought he would just ask me for the money. I thought he would try to manipulate me or guilt me into handing over the pension. I never in my darkest nightmares believed my own son would drive me to an abandoned park in the freezing rain, rip my purse from my shoulder, and leave me there to die. I never thought he would hire corrupt doctors to try and erase my basic human rights in a probate court. He crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." Mitchell sat forward, the predatory corporate shark energy returning to his eyes with a terrifying intensity. He turned back to his monitors and began typing, rapidly pulling up the commercial lease agreement Thomas had signed with Apex Holdings. "Thomas and Sharon have absolutely no idea who they are dealing with," Mitchell said, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. "They think they are leasing this downtown city block from a massive, faceless real estate conglomerate managed by a third-party broker. They think they are dealing with a boardroom full of anonymous executives. They have no clue they are leasing it from you, Ruth." Mitchell highlighted a specific section of the digital contract, his smile growing wide and dangerous. "And because they think they are dealing with a standard corporate entity, they signed a standard, ironclad commercial lease covenant." He tapped his heavy brass pen against the screen. "Right here, Section 4, Paragraph B, the Morality and Fraud Clause. It explicitly states that if the tenant engages in any illegal financial activities, commits wire fraud, or uses criminal misrepresentation to secure funding for the development project, the landlord has the absolute right to unilaterally terminate the commercial lease with zero notice and zero grace period." I looked at the screen, my heart pounding with a thrilling, triumphant rush of adrenaline. Thomas and Sharon just committed federal wire fraud to steal the pension. They forged a home equity line of credit using a fake notary stamp. They used that stolen money to pay their architects and to show the city they had liquid capital. "Exactly," Mitchell confirmed, spinning his chair to face us. "They have breached the lease covenant in at least 6 different ways. The entire foundation of their multi-million-dollar project is built on documented, verifiable felonies. If we trigger this termination clause, their development rights evaporate instantly. Without the lease, they have no collateral. Without collateral, they immediately default on their massive bank loans. They will be completely irreversibly bankrupt before the banks even open tomorrow morning." Mitchell did not waste another second. He immediately reached for his desk phone, hitting a speed dial button to connect with his senior legal team. "Get my lead paralegal in here right now," he ordered into the speaker. "I need formal commercial lease termination papers drafted for Apex Holdings immediately. Cite criminal financial fraud and breach of covenant. I want the documents printed, finalized, and ready to be filed with the county clerk in 10 minutes." He hung up the phone and looked at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. "We file this right now. We dispatch a corporate process server to your father's luxury home tonight. By the time he wakes up tomorrow, his entire empire will be reduced to ash. His presentation to the city council will be completely dead on arrival. We will ruin him quietly and efficiently, and the probate judge will have no choice but to drop the conservatorship case when Thomas is indicted for wire fraud." It was the perfect corporate execution, clean, fast, and totally devastating. It was exactly the kind of high-level legal strike Vanguard Legal Partners was famous for. But as I stood there in the pristine, quiet office, a dark, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I thought about the sheer terror in Ruth's eyes when I found her shivering on that rusted park bench. I thought about the arrogant, mocking sneer on my sister Brittany's face when she tried to force her way into my apartment. I thought about my mother cornering me in the courthouse hallway, gloating about how they were going to lock my grandmother away and steal everything she owned while the city cheered for their success. A quiet, efficient corporate termination was far too merciful. They did not deserve to hide their failures behind closed doors. They had built their entire public persona on being wealthy, upstanding community leaders. They craved the spotlight. They wanted the admiration of the mayor, the city council, and their wealthy investors. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over Mitchell's, stopping him from reaching for the printed documents his assistant had just rushed into the office. Mitchell stopped, looking at me with a confused, questioning expression. "Amber, we have the kill shot right here. What are you doing?" I looked at the lease termination papers, and then I looked at Ruth. My grandmother nodded slowly, a fierce, unspoken agreement passing between us. She understood exactly what I needed to do. "Do not file them yet," I said, my voice cold and hard as diamond, as Mitchell frowned, pulling his hand back. "If we wait, they go into that town hall meeting tomorrow night, thinking they have a valid project. They are going to stand at a podium and pitch this development to the entire city. Let them," I replied, a dark, calculating smile spreading across my face. "Let them put on their expensive suits. Let them invite the press. Let them stand in front of the mayor, the city council, and every wealthy private investor in Chicago. I want them to climb as high as they possibly can. Because when they fall, I want everyone to see exactly who they really are." Mitchell stared at me for a long moment. He slowly lowered the printed lease termination papers back onto his polished desk, his hands resting flat against the dark walnut surface. The predatory gleam in his eyes brightened into a look of absolute, profound respect. As a man who made his fortune destroying corrupt executives, he understood exactly what I was building. A private legal victory was a slap on the wrist. A public execution of reputation was a death sentence. "If we terminate the lease right now in the privacy of this office," I explained, pacing the length of the massive windows overlooking the Chicago River, "my father will spin the narrative. He is a master manipulator. He will run straight to the local news stations and claim that a greedy, faceless corporate conglomerate crushed his community-focused family business out of pure spite. He will play the victim. He will retain his social standing, keep his wealthy friends, and probably find another vulnerable target to scam within the year." Mitchell nodded slowly, a dark smile spreading across his face. "You are absolutely right. If we kill the deal in the shadows, he survives in the light. But if we let him stand on a public stage and present his project as a guaranteed success, he locks himself into the fraud in front of hundreds of witnesses." "Exactly," I said, turning back to face him. "I want him to look the mayor in the eye. I want him to shake hands with the city council. I want him to present the architectural blueprints he bought with my grandmother's forged property loan. To truly stop him, we have to let him climb to the very top of his pedestal. The higher the altitude, the more devastating the impact when the ground suddenly vanishes beneath his feet. Mitchell leaned forward, steepling his fingers together. We will hold the termination papers here. My team will prep the municipal police department. I have the direct cell phone number for the chief of police. I will brief him on the wire fraud and the forged property documents, so his officers are ready to move the exact second you expose the financial trail. You handle the numbers, Amber. I will handle the handcuffs. We left the towering corporate skyscraper and drove back to my apartment. The brutal winter storm from 2 nights ago had finally broken, leaving the city streets covered in a thick layer of gray, freezing slush. The harsh weather perfectly mirrored my internal state. I was cold, calculated, and entirely focused on the impending destruction of my parents' empire. I spent the next 24 hours operating on pure, unfiltered adrenaline. I sat at my dining room table drinking black coffee and staring at my dual monitors. As a financial auditor, I knew that presenting raw banking data to a room full of politicians and investors would not work. Politicians do not want to read complex spreadsheets. They want simple, undeniable narratives. I needed to translate my father's elaborate wire fraud into visual evidence that a child could understand. I built a massive digital presentation. I created clean, sharp bar graphs and bold flowcharts. I used bright red lines to trace the exact movement of the stolen pension money. I created a slide showing the 3 o'clock in the morning withdrawal from Ruth's retirement account and linked it directly to the deposits in the Nevada and Wyoming shell companies. I placed my father's social security number and corporate registration documents side by side on the screen, proving undeniably that he was the sole architect of the money laundering scheme. Next, I tackled the forged home equity line of credit. I scanned the 50-page property loan document and magnified the final signature page. I placed a copy of my grandmother's real verified signature from her vintage passport directly next to the clumsy, aggressive forgery my parents had submitted to the bank. The difference was glaringly obvious. I then pulled the employment records for Richard Vance, the notary public, who had illegally stamped the fraudulent document, proving he was on my father's direct payroll. But the financial data was only half of the weapon. I needed the emotional kill shot. I needed proof of their malicious intent. I pulled out my cell phone and accessed my saved voicemails. On the night I had found Ruth shivering in the park, right after my mother had hung up on me from her expensive restaurant, she had failed to properly lock her phone screen before dropping it back into her designer handbag. She had accidentally pocket-dialed me 3 minutes later. I had listened to that accidental voicemail a dozen times, my blood turning to ice with every playback. It captured a candid, horrifying conversation between my mother and my father as they sat at their restaurant table drinking expensive wine and laughing about abandoning an 82-year-old woman in the freezing sleet. I transferred the audio file to my laptop and ran it through a basic sound editing software to remove the background clinking of silverware and the restaurant jazz music. I amplified their voices until every cruel, callous word was crystal clear. I saved the visual spreadsheets, the forged property documents, and the cleaned audio file onto a sleek encrypted silver flash drive. I held the small piece of metal in the palm of my hand, feeling its weight. This was the bullet that was going to shatter my family's facade forever. Friday evening arrived with a sharp, biting chill in the air. Ruth and I dressed meticulously for the occasion. I wore my sharpest, darkest charcoal business suit, my hair pulled back into a severe professional knot. Ruth wore a stunning vintage emerald green coat, an elegant silk scarf, and pearl earrings. She did not look like a vulnerable ward of the state waiting for a conservatorship hearing. She looked like old money royalty. She looked like a woman who owned entire city blocks. We ordered a private car service to take us to the downtown municipal building. The historic town hall was a magnificent structure with towering limestone pillars, arched stained glass windows, and a massive vaulted ceiling. As we approached the venue, the street was lined with expensive luxury vehicles and local news vans. This was not a standard boring zoning meeting. This was the most highly anticipated commercial development pitch of the year. We stepped into the bustling, brightly lit lobby and remained in the shadows near the coat check, observing the scene through the open double doors leading into the main assembly hall. The room was packed. The mahogany pews were filled to capacity with wealthy private investors, local business owners, and prominent community leaders. The city council members were seated at a long elevated dais at the front of the room, reviewing their thick agenda packets. The mayor of Chicago stood near the front row, shaking hands and smiling for the press cameras. And right in the center of it all, soaking up the admiration of the room, were Thomas, Sharon, and Brittany. They looked absolutely flawless. My father wore a custom-tailored navy suit, projecting the image of a seasoned, reliable titan of industry. My mother wore a pristine white designer dress, a glittering diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. Brittany stood beside them in a chic, expensive outfit, likely funded entirely by the forged property loan, taking selfies with local socialites and posing for the local journalists. They were working this room with practiced, effortless charm. I watched my father shake the mayor's hand, laughing loudly at some unheard joke. I watched my mother place a gentle, familiar hand on the arm of a prominent city councilwoman, leaning in to whisper something friendly. They were projecting the ultimate image of the successful, philanthropic American family. They were selling a narrative of integrity, community enrichment, and boundless prosperity. Looking at them, no one in that room could possibly guess that they had spent their week terrorizing an elderly woman lying to police officers and submitting fake medical records to a probate court. They looked completely untouchable. I felt Ruth's hand wrap gently around my arm. I looked down at her. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of absolute stoic calm. She gave my arm a firm, reassuring squeeze. The overhead lights in the assembly hall began to dim, signaling the start of the official proceedings. The wealthy attendees took their seats in the pews, and the journalists aimed their camera lenses toward the front podium. The mayor stepped up to the microphone, tapping it twice to bring the bustling room to order. "Good evening, everyone," the mayor announced, his booming voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "We have a very exciting agenda tonight. We are here to review a commercial development proposal that promises to revitalize our downtown sector, bring thousands of new jobs to the city, and establish a new standard for community-focused architecture. I would like to invite the executive team of Apex Urban Development Group to the floor." Thunderous applause broke out across the room. Thomas buttoned his suit jacket, flashing a brilliant, humble smile to the crowd. He placed his hand on the small of my mother's back, guiding her toward the center podium, with Brittany following closely behind them, like a dutiful, perfect daughter. I looked at the silver flash drive clutched tightly in my hand. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. There was no fear left in me, only a deep, resounding hunger for absolute justice. "Now," I whispered to Ruth. As my father adjusted the microphone at the podium and prepared to deliver his opening remarks, Ruth and I slipped silently through the heavy oak doors. We walked across the plush carpet at the back of the hall, moving completely unnoticed in the dim lighting. We took our seats in the very last row, shrouded in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The assembly hall fell completely silent as my father tapped the microphone. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished wood of the podium, and projected his voice with the smooth, practiced cadence of a seasoned politician. Behind him, massive digital screens illuminated the room with stunning, high-resolution architectural renderings of the proposed commercial plaza. It looked completely flawless. There were pristine walkways, smiling digital families, and towering glass structures that promised endless revenue for the city of Chicago. "We call this the Apex Initiative." Thomas began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "But to my wife Sharon and me, it is much more than just a real estate development. It is a commitment to the very foundation of this great city. We built our company on the core principles of family values, unyielding integrity, and a deep, abiding respect for the generations that came before us." Sharon stepped up beside him, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder and smiling warmly at the crowd. "Exactly," she added, her tone dripping with manufactured sincerity. "We want to build a legacy that honors our community, a place where families can gather, where local businesses can thrive, and where the economic growth of our suburbs can be secured for decades to come. This project is fully funded, fully backed by our private capital, and ready to break ground the moment the City Council grants the zoning permits." Sitting in the dimly lit back row, I felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. I glanced at my grandmother Ruth, who was watching her son lie to a room full of powerful investors with a completely stoic expression. They were standing under the bright spotlight, preaching about honoring their elders, just 48 hours after they had ripped her purse from her hands and abandoned her in a freezing rainstorm. They were bragging about their private capital, which was entirely stolen from the 82-year-old woman sitting quietly beside me. The wealthy investors in the front row were nodding in approval. The local journalists were furiously taking notes. My sister Brittany was sitting in the front pew beaming with pride as she watched our parents flawlessly execute their massive deception. The presentation lasted for another 20 minutes, filled with empty promises and fabricated financial projections. When Thomas finally concluded his pitch, the room erupted into enthusiastic applause. He had them right in the palm of his hand. "Thank you, Thomas and Sharon," the mayor announced, stepping back up to his own microphone at the city council dais. "A truly impressive vision for our downtown sector. As is customary for developments seeking municipal tax breaks, we will now open the floor for a brief public question and answer session. Please step up to the center aisle microphone if you wish to address the developers." This was the moment, the kill shot. I stood up from the wooden pew. I smoothed the front of my charcoal business suit, gripped the encrypted silver flash drive in my right hand, and stepped out of the shadows. I walked down the long center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The hall was massive, and it took a few seconds for people to notice me approaching the public microphone. But my father noticed immediately. I watched his charismatic, victorious smile freeze. His eyes locked onto me from the podium, and the color drained completely from his face. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. Sharon followed his gaze, her breath hitching audibly into her lapel microphone. Brittany actually half stood up from her seat in the front row, her mouth falling open in sheer panic. "Security!" Thomas hissed into his microphone, his polished demeanor cracking instantly. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Security! Remove this woman from the building immediately. She is not an authorized investor. She is a hostile party attempting to disrupt a private commercial presentation." Two large uniformed security guards positioned at the sides of the hall immediately stepped forward. They moved swiftly toward the center aisle, their hands reaching out to grab my arms and pull me away from the microphone stand. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, staring dead into my father's terrified eyes. "Hold on a minute," a booming voice echoed from the elevated city council dais. "Security, stand down." The guards stopped mere inches from me, turning confused to look at the front of the room. The mayor of Chicago leaned forward in his large leather chair, peering over his glasses at me. He raised a hand, signaling the guards to back away. "Thomas, I do not know what kind of family dispute you have going on," the mayor said, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "But that woman standing at the microphone is not a hostile party. That is Amber Davies." A loud murmur rippled through the city council members sitting at the long table. A few of them leaned forward, recognizing me instantly from my previous work with the municipal government. "For those of you in the audience who do not know her," the mayor continued, addressing the confused investors and journalists. "Miss Davies is one of the most ruthless, brilliant financial auditors in the state of Illinois. 3 years ago, she spearheaded an independent municipal tax audit that exposed a massive embezzlement ring within our own Public Works Department. She single-handedly saved this city over $12 million in misappropriated public funds. If Miss Davies has a question regarding the financial integrity of a commercial development seeking city tax breaks, she absolutely has the floor." My father looked like he was going to be physically sick. He opened his mouth to object, to spout some frantic lie about my mental state or the emergency conservatorship, but the mayor shot him a glare that silenced him completely. "You do not argue with the mayor in his own building when you are begging his city for a lucrative contract." "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," I said, leaning into the public microphone. My voice was cold, steady, and amplified across the entire assembly hall. "And you are absolutely correct. I do have a question regarding the financial integrity of this project." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the rage that had been boiling inside me for the past 48 hours. I operated with the clinical surgical precision of a specialized auditor dissecting a corrupt corporation. I pulled the encrypted silver flash drive from my pocket and handed it to the audiovisual technician standing next to the center aisle. Please run the primary executable file on this drive, I instructed the technician. The massive digital screens behind my parents flickered. The beautiful fake architectural renderings of their commercial plaza vanished instantly. In their place, a massive, stark white spreadsheet appeared filled with bright red lines, banking codes, and digital timestamps. The room fell dead silent as the wealthy investors stared up at the raw financial data towering over the podium. Let us talk about family values, Thomas, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife. You just stood in front of this city council and claimed that this multi-million-dollar project is fully backed by your own private liquid capital. You submitted bank statements to the Planning Commission proving that Apex Urban Development Group has the cash on hand to begin construction tomorrow. I clicked a remote laser pointer and a bright red circle highlighted a specific transaction on the massive screen. But that is a complete, verifiable lie, I stated clearly. This spreadsheet maps the exact routing protocols of your supposed private capital. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, while a severe winter storm battered this city, an unauthorized wire transfer was initiated. The money did not come from a corporate investor. It was systematically drained from the personal retirement pension of an 82-year-old woman. My grandmother. Loud gasps echoed through the heavy wooden pews. The journalists sitting in the front rows scrambled to lift their cameras, snapping rapid-fire photos of the projected bank transfers. The camera flashes illuminated the sheer terror on my parents' faces. I clicked the pointer again. The screen zoomed in, showing the complex web of shell companies I had uncovered in my apartment. You did not just steal her life savings, Thomas. You routed her pension through 3 separate blind holding companies registered to your personal Social Security number in Nevada and Wyoming. You laundered stolen elder abuse funds to create fake corporate liquidity, and then you had the absolute audacity to stand in front of this city council and ask for municipal tax breaks. Thomas gripped the podium, his face sweating profusely under the harsh stage lights. Sharon took a physical step back, looking like she wanted to bolt for the emergency exit, but realizing there was nowhere to hide. Brittany was frozen in the front row, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic destruction of their empire unfolding in real time. The entire room was watching the undeniable, highly documented forensic proof of their massive federal wire fraud. The sudden deafening silence in the Grand Assembly Hall was shattered by the frantic clicking of camera shutters. The local journalists in the front rows were practically climbing over each other to get clear shots of the massive digital screens displaying my forensic spreadsheets. They had come to cover a boring municipal zoning meeting and had suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a massive federal fraud scandal. The wealthy private investors, the very people my parents were relying on to fund the remaining phases of their commercial plaza, were staring up at the irrefutable proof of money laundering with expressions of sheer horror. My father Thomas stood paralyzed behind the polished wooden podium, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the edges of the stand. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling every narrative, bullying people into submission and buying his way out of consequences. But right now, pinned under the harsh glare of the public stage lights, he had absolutely nowhere to run. The banking codes, the forged signatures, and his own social security number were projected in high definition for the entire city to see. Sharon. My mother looked like she was going to collapse. She took another unsteady step backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet of the stage. She raised a shaking hand to her throat, her eyes darting wildly around the room, desperately searching for a friendly face, a sympathetic ally, or a convenient exit. There were none. The elite socialites she had spent years schmoozing were currently looking at her like she was a highly contagious disease. But my sister Brittany was not ready to surrender. She had spent her entire 29 years being handed the world on a silver platter, entirely funded by the very fraud I was currently exposing. She refused to watch her luxury lifestyle brand and her limitless trust fund evaporate into thin air. Brittany suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She bolted from her seat in the front pew, her face flushed dark red with absolute panic and furious indignation. She rushed up the short set of stairs to the stage, moving past our completely shell-shocked parents. She lunged for a secondary microphone stand positioned near the edge of the dais, grabbing the microphone with both hands. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying," Brittany screamed into the microphone, her shrill voice echoing violently through the vaulted ceiling of the town hall. The sudden noise made several city council members physically flinch. Brittany pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at me as I stood calmly in the center aisle. "She is insane. She is a deeply disgruntled, jealous sister, making up wild lies because she is a complete failure." Amber has always been bitter that my parents refused to fund her boring, pathetic little accounting career. She has spent her entire life trying to sabotage this family because she is unhinged and completely estranged from us. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my face a mask of cold, unyielding calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her. I simply let her unravel in front of hundreds of people. "These spreadsheets are completely fabricated," Brittany continued, her voice growing increasingly hysterical as she turned to address the wealthy investors sitting in the front rows. "Anyone can type numbers into a computer and put them on a screen. Anyone can use Photoshop to make a signature look fake. She is just a bitter, low-level accountant trying to ruin our family legacy out of pure, vicious jealousy. Our grandmother is extremely sick. She has severe Alzheimer's disease, and Amber kidnapped her to try and extort us for money. You cannot believe anything this desperate woman says." She stood there breathing heavily into the microphone, her eyes wide and pleading as she looked at the mayor and the city council. She was banking everything on her usual strategy. She was trying to play the pretty distressed victim, hoping her aggressive gaslighting would cast just enough reasonable doubt on my financial data to stall the presentation. She wanted the city officials to write this off as a messy, complicated family dispute rather than a clear-cut case of federal wire fraud. I looked at her feeling absolutely nothing but a profound clinical detachment. I did not need to yell. I did not need to defend my character or justify my career. I had brought the ultimate equalizer. Financial records can sometimes be complex for the general public to verify at a glance. I stated, speaking calmly into my own microphone in the center aisle. My voice cut through her hysterical, lingering echoes with chilling authority. "Numbers can be debated by expensive lawyers in courtrooms. Signatures can be contested by paid experts. But malicious, premeditated intent is universal. The absolute cruelty of what you have done does not require an accounting degree to understand." I turned my attention away from my frantic sister and looked directly at the audiovisual technician standing by the soundboard. "Please transition from the visual data to the secondary audio file," I instructed the technician clearly. The massive digital spreadsheets vanished from the screens behind my parents, replaced by a simple stark black screen displaying a single audio waveform graphic. 2 nights ago, when my parents abandoned an 82-year-old woman in a freezing rainstorm at Centennial Park, my mother accidentally failed to lock her phone screen before dropping it into her designer purse, I explained to the silent, captivated room. She inadvertently pocket-dialed my number while she and my father were sitting at a 5-star restaurant. I saved the voicemail. I removed the background noise of the restaurant. I think the city council and the private investors funding this project should hear exactly how the executive team of Apex Urban Development Group conducts their family business. Brittany dropped her microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of feedback. Sharon let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Thomas lunged forward desperately, trying to wave off the technician, but he was entirely too late. The audio technician pressed play. The high-fidelity speakers mounted around the massive assembly hall crackled to life. The cleaned, amplified audio filled every corner of the historic building. There was the faint, unmistakable sound of crystal wine glasses clinking together, followed immediately by my mother's sharp, cruel laughter. "She is probably freezing her stubborn toes off by now." My mother's voice echoed through the town hall, crisp and undeniably clear. "I told you, Thomas, we just need to let her sit on that rusted bench for another hour or two. The sleet will completely break her spirit. Once she is cold enough, she will sign the pension voting papers without even reading them." A collective horrified murmur ripped through the entire audience. The wealthy investors in the front row stared at the stage in absolute, unadulterated disgust. But the recording was not finished. My father's voice boomed through the speakers next, sounding arrogant, deeply amused, and entirely predatory. Let the old bat freeze, my father's recorded voice replied smoothly. It does not really matter if she signs the pension release tonight anyway. Richard Vance already stamped the property loan documents for the house. I cannot believe how easy it was to forge her signature on a $500,000 line of credit. Richard did not even ask a single question before he applied his notary seal. As long as we have the architectural blueprints funded by the house loan, we can just wash her pension money through the Nevada shell companies tomorrow to show the city we have liquid capital. We are going to be completely untouchable, Sharon. The audio file ended with the distinct sound of them clinking their wine glasses together in a celebratory toast, followed by my mother's self-satisfied wicked laugh. The silence that followed the recording was heavier and far more dangerous than anything I had ever experienced. It was the crushing, absolute silence of total societal destruction. The truth was no longer just numbers on a screen. It was raw, vicious, and completely undeniable. Every single person in that room had just heard two prominent, wealthy socialites laughing about torturing an elderly woman in the freezing rain and casually confessing to a massive real estate forgery. The reaction was immediate and utterly devastating. A prominent silver-haired investor sitting in the very center of the front row stood up abruptly. He did not say a single word. He simply reached down, picked up his expensive leather briefcase, and snapped the golden clasps shut with a loud, definitive click. He turned his back on the stage and began walking briskly toward the main exit. His movement broke the spell. Within seconds, a dozen other wealthy investors and private capital managers stood up. They gathered their coats, grabbed their briefcases, and began filing out of the wooden pews in a mass exodus of fleeing capital. Nobody wants their money tied to a highly publicized federal fraud investigation. Nobody wants their corporate brand associated with egregious elder abuse. They were abandoning the Apex initiative instantly, completely severing any potential financial ties to my parents' toxic radioactive empire. Up on the elevated dais, the city council members were whispering furiously to one another, their faces pale with shock and outrage. The mayor was leaning over his desk, conferring urgently with the city attorney, violently shaking his head and pointing toward the exit. The local journalists were practically running to the back of the room to broadcast the bombshell audio recording to their news stations. The entire carefully constructed facade of my parents' elite, untouchable lives was burning to the ground in real time. My mother collapsed into one of the chairs on the stage, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically as the reality of her total ruin crashed down upon her. Brittany was standing frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she watched her endless trust fund and luxury lifestyle evaporate before her very eyes. But my father was not breaking down. He was completely losing his mind. The realization that his reputation was annihilated, his investors were fleeing, and his grand public presentation was turning into a criminal tribunal caused his fragile ego to violently snap. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his custom-tailored suit. Sweat poured down his forehead as he realized he was entirely cornered. He lunged forward, grabbing the main podium microphone with both hands, gripping it so tightly the plastic casing groaned under the pressure. He leaned over the wood, his eyes wide and completely unhinged, glaring down at me with a look of pure homicidal rage. "It does not matter," Thomas screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperate, furious panic. His shout echoed violently through the chaotic hall, forcing some of the exiting investors to stop and look back at the stage. "You hear me, Amber? It does not matter what you play on that screen. It does not matter what you say to these people. We already have the land." He pounded his fist against the podium. "The commercial lease is signed. I control the development rights for this entire city block. I hold the municipal contracts. I hold the power. You are just a pathetic, jealous little accountant, and you cannot stop us. We are going to build this empire, and you can take your senile, worthless grandmother and rot in hell, you ungrateful brat." He stood there, chest heaving, his face slick with sweat, believing with every ounce of his narcissistic soul that his signed corporate lease made him entirely invincible. He thought he possessed the ultimate legal shield. He had absolutely no idea that the real owner of that lease was sitting quietly in the very back row of the assembly hall, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final fatal blow. The heavy wooden gavel never fell. Judge Harrison never got the chance to make his ruling because the timeline of my story had already shifted entirely. I am sorry to break the narrative flow, but I need to make sure you are following exactly what happened next. The assembly hall fell completely silent as my father tapped the microphone. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished wood of the podium. His frantic screaming faded into the massive vaulted ceiling of the town hall. He actually believed his signed lease was an impenetrable shield. He actually thought he had won. In the very last row of the assembly hall, a figure slowly stood up. It was Ruth. She did not rush. She did not look angry or panicked. She stepped out from the shadows of the back pews, wearing her stunning emerald green coat and her pearl earrings. She held her head perfectly high, radiating the kind of absolute, undeniable dignity that cannot be bought or faked. The wealthy investors who were rushing toward the exit suddenly stopped in their tracks. The city council members lowered their microphones. The entire room fell into a profound, breathless silence. Everyone had just heard the horrifying audio recording of my parents laughing about abandoning this exact woman in the freezing rain. Seeing her in person, standing strong and completely composed, commanded an immediate, absolute respect from every single person in that building. Ruth walked down the long center aisle. Her footsteps were the only sound in the massive hall. I stepped to the side, making room for her at the public microphone. She reached the stand, placed her hands gently on the edges, and looked directly up at the stage. She looked her son Thomas dead in the eye. Thomas stared down at her, his chest heaving. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Sharon was trembling so violently that the diamonds on her necklace were shaking. "Mr. Mayor," Ruth said, her voice clear, steady, and projecting perfectly across the silent room. "My name is Ruth Evelyn Davies." The mayor leaned forward, his expression softening with genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Davies," he said gently, "we are all incredibly sorry for what you have endured. I promise you the city will involve the proper authorities immediately to handle this abuse." "I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor," Ruth replied calmly. "But I am not standing here tonight merely as the victim of their financial theft. I am standing here as the primary shareholder and the sole controlling executive of Apex Holdings." The entire room seemed to physically jolt. The mayor blinked, his mouth falling slightly open. The city attorney sitting next to him frantically flipped through his thick binder of property deeds, his eyes widening to the size of saucers as he verified her claim. Thomas literally gripped his own hair. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell. He looked from Ruth to me, and then back to Ruth, his mind finally painfully connecting the dots. "You," Thomas gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "The blind trust. You own the holding company." Ruth did not blink. She reached into her emerald green coat and pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing the embossed seal of Vanguard Legal Partners. It was the corporate lease termination agreement that Mitchell had drafted for us in his downtown office. "You thought I was just a senile old woman you could leave on a park bench," Ruth said clearly into the microphone. "You thought you could strip me of my dignity, steal my life savings, and lock me away in a medical facility just to fund your vanity project. You assumed I was financially illiterate because I chose to live a quiet, modest life." She held up the legal document for the entire room to see. "But I am your landlord," she stated, her voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. "And you signed a commercial lease covenant that explicitly forbids criminal financial fraud. As of this exact moment, your lease is permanently terminated. You have no development rights. You have no municipal contract. You have absolutely nothing." The destruction was instantaneous and absolute. Without the commercial lease, the Apex initiative evaporated into thin air. Without the development rights, the massive bank loans my parents had secured would instantly default. They were no longer wealthy socialites pitching a city contract. They were bankrupt criminals standing on a stage with a multi-million-dollar deficit they could never possibly repay. Sharon let out a loud, piercing wail and collapsed onto the floor of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably, as her entire luxury lifestyle shattered into a million pieces. Brittany fell to her knees in the front row, covering her face and weeping loudly as she realized her endless trust fund and her entire identity were permanently gone. Thomas stumbled backward away from the podium. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He looked around the room, searching for any possible escape, but there was nowhere left to run. The heavy double doors at the back of the assembly hall suddenly swung open. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives strode purposely into the room. Mitchell had kept his promise. He had legally briefed the chief of police earlier that afternoon, providing them with the forged home equity line of credit documents and the evidence of federal wire fraud. The police had been waiting quietly in the lobby for the exact moment the financial exposé was complete. The officers marched straight down the center aisle, moving past Ruth and me without a word. They climbed the short stairs to the stage. Thomas Davies, one of the detectives, announced, his voice cutting through Sharon's hysterical sobbing. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." Thomas did not fight. He did not yell. He simply held out his wrists, his eyes vacant and utterly defeated. The officer secured the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, the metallic clicks echoing sharply through the microphones still active on the stage. Another officer pulled Sharon to her feet, reading her Miranda rights as he handcuffed her. A third officer approached the front row and detained Brittany, who was screaming that she had nothing to do with it, completely abandoning her parents in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save herself. The wealthy investors, the journalists, and the city council watched in absolute silence as the flawless Golden family was marched out of the town hall in utter disgrace. They had walked into the building expecting to be crowned the kings of the city. They were walking out in handcuffs, facing decades in federal prison. The mayor looked down at us from the dais. He slowly stood up from his leather chair and began to clap. Within seconds, the city council members joined him. Then the investors stood up. Soon, the entire assembly hall was giving a standing ovation, not for a commercial real estate project, but for an 82-year-old woman and her granddaughter who had flawlessly dismantled a criminal empire. I looked down at Ruth. She smiled at me, a bright, triumphant spark lighting up her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the city of Chicago. The fallout for my family was absolute and entirely merciless. Thomas and Sharon were indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe elder abuse. Facing an insurmountable mountain of forensic accounting evidence and the viral audio recording of their cruel park conversation, their expensive defense lawyers advised them to take a plea deal. They were both sentenced to significant time in federal prison. Without the stolen pension money to prop up her failing businesses, Brittany filed for total bankruptcy within 3 weeks. Her luxury lifestyle brand collapsed. Her expensive cars were repossessed, and her wealthy socialite friends entirely abandoned her the moment her name became toxic. She was currently working a minimum-wage retail job, forced to finally experience the grueling reality of a life she could not buy her way out of. As for Ruth and me, our lives had transformed in the most beautiful, peaceful ways imaginable. I resigned from my municipal auditing firm and officially took over the executive management of Apex Holdings. Sitting in the sleek, quiet boardroom of my new corporate office, I watched as Ruth signed the final succession documents. She officially transferred the entire holding trust, the vast commercial real estate portfolio, and her complete estate over to me. She knew I had the brilliant analytical mind required to protect and grow our true family legacy. Later that evening, we sat together on the wide back patio of my newly purchased beautiful suburban home. The summer air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of the prize-winning rose bushes Ruth had just finished planting in the garden. She was safe, she was happy, and she was entirely protected. I sat back in my chair, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. I thought about the scared, exhausted girl I used to be. I thought about all the years I spent internalizing my parents' cruel insults, believing I was nothing but a boring, glorified calculator who would never measure up to their impossible standards. I had finally shed the toxic label of the family scapegoat forever. I did not just save my grandmother from a frozen park bench. I saved myself. I proved that my practical, analytical mind was not a weakness. It was the ultimate weapon. I learned that your true family is not determined by the people who share your blood, especially if those people are willing to abandon you in the cold. True family is determined by the people who recognize your true worth, who secretly fund your dreams, and who stand right beside you when it is time to burn a corrupt empire to the ground.